If you've always wanted to paint roses but felt a little intimidated because of all those petals, I'm going to try to demystify the steps for painting a rose and leaves. You'll see how I mix the values ahead of time, which really simplifies the process. I'm going to put in a super simple drawing, focusing on large, simple shapes and leaving the details until last. If that feels too intimidating, I'll also provide a downloadable photo that you can copy right onto your canvas. You'll see the colors I use to put in some super darks to help that rose pop forward. As I lay in the correct colors and values, I'll explain how to simplify the thought process. If you can understand the thought process, it really takes the mystery out of painting all those petals. I'll show you how I make believable shadow colors for a light colored rose. If you get the right color and the right value into the right place, it's a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, and before you know it, things just start falling into place. You'll see me hold off onto the detail until the very end of the painting. One of the things I like to do with my videos is to show you any mistakes that I make and how I fix them. With this painting, I decided near the end that I didn't really like the color I had used for the center, so you'll hear my thoughts about that and see how I make some subtle color shifts to make this rose even softer and more beautiful. You'll also see some easy tricks for making believable leaves. You'll see how to put in just a few detailed leaves with the suggestion of leaves and the rest of the background. While this course isn't designed for the brand new painter, I do try to simplify and give you hints on how to make it easier to understand. I did this painting in acrylics with a slow dry medium. This tutorial would also work for an oil painter. It was a lot of fun, and I hope you'll come join me in this. Today I'm going to be painting a rose, and the photograph was a free photograph from Paint My Photos. They are a great reference source, and I wanted to keep it super simple, and I had thought about just using one color in white, but I'm going to use a couple of colors. The first one, this one, is a Liquitex Rosy Pink. And I was going to use alizarin crimson to darken that center, but I decided kind of at the last minute to use a quinacridone magenta. So that's what I'm going to use to deepen the center of the rose. I usually use a heavy body titanium white, but I decided because I want these petals to look as translucent as possible, I'm just using a Liquitex Basics, which will not give me the coverage that the heavy body would give me. For the foliage, I've got sap green, which I use in almost every painting. I just love sap green. It's just a great dark green. And then for this lighter green, I'm using a Lucas olive green. I'm going to be adding a slow dry medium to these paints. The one that I happen to use is Golden Open Slow Dry Acrylic Medium. Most of the paint companies make a slow dry medium. I don't know that it really matters which one. This is just the one that I use. I like this one a lot though because it does have this little screw top and it makes it easy to add a drop here and there. Sometimes I'll add this medium to my paint. Sometimes I'll just put a little pile of it in the corner and dip my brush in it before I dip into paint. So I think that's probably, well actually I think I'm going to mix a few piles first of all. So the center of that rose is the deepest, and that's where I'm going to put a little bit of our light pink. Oops, I decided I wasn't going to use that alizarin. Let's going to put a little bit of the magenta in there and just get a rich, strong pink for that center. I think that's beautiful. And then, so we want to have some easy color transitions, getting more and more pale as you go out. And this rose is paler than I'm probably going to paint it. I do like to crank the color up a little bit in my paintings. So if you want to stay true to the photograph, I would use a lot less of this color with much more white. But for our purposes, I'm going to just pull a little bit of that same color into a pile now, and I'm going to just mix some white. And that's still pretty colorful. Then I'm going to pull and I'm not mixing this to death. It doesn't bother me that there's a little variation in there. Then I'm going to take that color, I'm going to pull it down, and I'm going to put even more white in it. And those petals out at the edge get almost white. They're not white. So I'm just going to keep adding some white till I feel like that looks soft enough. You want to make sure whatever you do, whatever reds you use, whatever pinks you use, you could do a yellow rose. You want to make sure that the center, that you have 3 distinct values, and you want the petals, if you want the petals to look really light, you're going to have to really add a lot of white, and that deep center is going to give you a nice depth, and it'll give you a place for the petals on top to show up. So I encourage you to at least get 3 good values. I'm going to have a 4th. I'll probably have something almost pure white at the very edge. Still, there's the slightest touch of pink in there, but it's going to basically read like white. I might even, and then, so try not to use pure white until the very end, and you might want to do a little pure white as a highlight on the edge of a petal. But if you start out with it too white, you don't leave yourself any place to go. I'm going to wait on the foliage. My green, you can tell this is a heavy body, and this is not, as it is run down the palette. I am using a small Masterson Stay Wet palette. I usually use a big palette with a pop-off lid. This one is just a real small one that I find helpful when I'm just using a couple of colors. So I'm going to go ahead and put just a little drop of this Stay Wet solution, slow dry medium. Let me open that back up, into each of these piles. It doesn't take a lot, and if you put too much medium in there, you can dilute the paint to the point that it affects the paint. So this is kind of dried, so I'm just pulling that. It gets kind of rubbery like a little bottle of glue. So if it does, just pull that out. So I'm going to add a drop. These are small piles of paint, so I'm only putting 1 drop. Of course, if you had a bigger pile of paint, you would use more medium. And then I'm just going to blend that in. And after each color, I'm going to wipe it with a paper towel so that I'm keeping that pile pure and just blending that medium into each pile. I'm using an 8x10 stretch canvas that's been pre-gessoed. I bought it pre-gessoed. Some people like to add another coat of gesso. I'm just too lazy to do that. I don't do that unless I'm painting over something. So now we've got our 4 piles, and I still have room with that palest pink. I still have room for white. So what I want to do first, and you know, there are different ways to paint roses. I think sometimes people feel very intimidated with roses and peonies because there's so many petals, but I want to show you what I think is a fairly simple way to do this. And one of the best pieces of advice that I heard another artist say, and I don't remember who said it or I would give them credit for it, but they were talking about being real careful with the outside edge, because when your eye looks at something, it uses that outside edge to see what type of flower it is, particularly like with geraniums. You know, I'm real careful with the outside edge, and you can kind of mess up a little bit in the center, but if that outside edge reads correctly, then it just goes better. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to use a round brush. I'm using a Princeton Summit round brush. This is a size 2, and I'm just going to dip into this palest pink, and let's see if it's dark enough that I can see it on this white canvas. Pretty soon I'm going to go in and add some green background just to help you see this. I know it can be hard on camera looking at white on white. So I'm just looking at the outside edges, and I'm going to make this rose fairly large. It's going to take up most of the canvas. I'm going to start down here at the bottom. Okay, I think I'm going to need something a little darker. So I'm going to drop down into that lower, and I'm just loosely drawing those petals the way that I see them. Personally, I like things that run off the canvas a little bit. You may not like that. If you want to make your rose smaller to where it stays contained, that's fine. I think I'm going to go ahead and kind of determine where my center is. Then I'm going to continue on. Be mindful as you're drawing this in where petals overlap. You want to keep this kind of organic and loose, and don't overthink it. Don't overthink it. And if you'll notice, some places on the petal are very round, and then we have some places, right, this corner is very sharp, and that's just how roses do. You've got some sharp corners like here, then you've got some places that are rounded like here. Try to be true to those. And different types of roses are different, so I'm just trying to so we've got a leaf that comes over this, which I like that. So we'll remember that that's a leaf. There's a little wood stem there. I like that. It's always nice with any kind of foliage and flowers, if some things can overlap here and there, that really helps it to look more organic. And it's just more interesting that way. And again, I'm being very mindful. What does that outside edge look like? And I'm seeing points, and I'm seeing round. Here's a kind of a lone petal that just goes off. It's just kind of squared off. In front of this petal is one here. It comes just straight down. You can also, I'll include this photograph, and you can print it off if you want to use some carbon paper or a projector. You can always just print it off, and sometimes I like to do that in the interest of saving time, and particularly like if I've got a house with a lot of different angles and things, sometimes that can help keep the integrity. We've got a big petal coming down. And then we've got these little, don't forget these little ones on the outside edge, because these are the ones that are going to be so white, and they're really going to look real translucent. You see a little corner here that kind of disappears, and another corner down here. These little edges are important, and again, they're going to help your painting to read correctly. Actually, this comes down here to a point. Okay? So that's a very loose drawing. We can kind of play with the leaves a little bit later and get some leaves put in. I don't want to, in fact, I might just go ahead and using this olive green, I might mix a little white in it just so it doesn't get too dark, and just to kind of give us a reference point. I might just, and that's going to be way too light, but just to kind of give us a reference point where these leaves are. I'm going to go a little darker since I know that'll just help me remember that that is behind this leaf, and to not include that. Okay. I think before we start putting in the rose, just to help you see this a little easier, I'm going to go ahead and just drop some greens in. I'm just going to alternate between my sap green and my olive green and just get some darks in there. I might mix those two a little bit just to help you see where those edges are. We'll go back over this. This is just really loosey-goosey, just trying to help you see where these petals are and what's happening here. But I would say this too, as we're doing this, this is not a bad thing to do on your painting before you put the leaves in, rather than trying to paint every single leaf in, to just get a mingled, mottled kind of background going with a variety of greens. And then you can go in and put in a few specific leaves, but you're not having to worry about covering every bit of canvas. So I might speed this up for you, but just wanted you to get a feel for how I was going to drop that background in. Again, that's just the sap green and the olive green. I'm dipping my brush in both piles. There are a lot of different ways for painting roses. I tend to take the path of least resistance because I don't want to get bogged down in all these petals. And if you'll notice, I really just have put in the main largest petal shapes. There are a lot of petals in between here that I have not painted in. We're going to do those last, and I'm going to show you how to just put those in at the end, and I think it's pretty easy and simple. I'm going to switch over to a slightly softer brush. This is a Rosalind Company Classic Long Flat, size 6. I use these brushes a lot. The ends of them are not super straight when you compare it to this Princeton Summit Flat, which I like this brush a lot also, but I find that going with this rosemary, it just keeps things a little bit softer. So I'm going to start with this. When I go in and start putting in fine, thin petals, I'll probably switch over to this Princeton Summit. So I'm going to start with our darkest color, and I'm going to work out, move out, going to lighter and lighter. I don't want a sharp edge between those two colors. It's very soft and blended in our rose, and I want to get the same effect here. So as I'm putting these colors in, you're going to see me going back over edges and just softening them up. And I'm just taking my brush and I'm just going to kind of do a cross hatch, moving that brush a little bit just to blend those colors so they keep moving further and further out. So you'll notice I just have the largest petal shapes here. There are a lot of little petals within this area and through here that I did not draw in because we're going to put those in last. So right now I'm just trying to get in the darker color, then we'll go back over it with some individual petals. So we're just going to get the center nice and dark. Again, this is a little darker than our photograph, but that's okay. I'm intentionally doing that. If you don't want to do that, you can always add some white to it. But I have found there are a few places in this painting or in this rose that are super dark, like right in here, where you're going to have a petal going across it, and it needs to be dark enough. So I'm just going to, this is just the pure magenta. I'm just dropping that pure magenta in a couple of spots. And again, we're going to have petals covering that. You're not going to see those edges, but just so we get that dark enough. I did change my water when I finished doing the green so that I could keep my water real clean. I really encourage you to do that. Okay, so now we're going to this next value, and we're going to start moving out. Actually, it gets a little darker. Just keep looking at your reference. It gets a little darker back up in this corner. I'm going to wipe my, I'm just keeping a, I like these Viva cloth paper towels. They're less noisy when filming, I have found, when I use the other regular paper towels. They're so crunchy sounding with my microphone. So I'm just continuing to move around this. So this area right here where these two meet, and you might be thinking, why don't you soften that edge? That's because there's a petal that's going to go through there. But any place where there's not a petal, like this to the end of that, like here, I'm going to drop in this lighter pink, and that's where I'm going to soften that edge. I've just wiped my brush off, and I'm just going to soften that edge so that you get a nice, a nice soft transition. So now I'm pulling into this third pink, and I'm just getting that edge. Try to cover your lines. See, that line is showing a little bit, where the line is a little darker than the color, so I'm going to have to do another little coat to get that covered. You know, sometimes I'll draw things in with pencil, but I felt like the pencil wouldn't show up enough for you to see it. So I'm going to go back in with this dark pink and just get that in. Okay. There's also a little dark pink right under here. And then it moves into a shadow that's not really pink. It's a little grayer. We're going to have to figure out what we're going to do with that. I might take our pink pile. I'm going to take a little bit of this medium pink, and I'm going to add just the tiniest touch. I'm just putting a tiny bit of that green on my brush, and I'm going to mix that together, and it's just going to dull that down. If it's too dark, we can lighten it. But see how you still get the feeling it's a white flower with some pink in it, but it's really dulled down. I think that's just a great trick, just to add a touch of green, just to slightly create a shadow for us in here. It's going to be real obvious that that's a shadow, so just look at your reference, follow that shadow. I didn't mix much of that, but it's just nice and dull, but it will read like a shadow. Okay, we also, down at the bottom of this bottom petal, it gets even a little greener than that. So I'm going to mix up a little bit more of that, but make it slightly greener. It may be a little too green. I'm going to put a little bit more pink in that. So I'm using this middle value pink and our olive green just to dull that down, and I'm getting that edge. There's some shadow right here. Shadows are really important. They are what are going to give your painting dimension. You don't want these petals to look like something white paper that you've cut out and just laid on. You've got to get these shadows in for this to read correctly. You'll see a little shadow up underneath some of these petals right around the edge, and that's just going to show you that this petal is on top of that one, so don't neglect. There's a little shadow going across here. There's a little shadow in that petal. Now, like, this is the place where this petal is on top of that one, but you're seeing that pink line. If you can't get that covered, what you may have to do is just go back through with pure titanium white, cover that. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Cover that and let it dry, and then go back over it with your shadow, and that'll get rid of that. I'm going to add a little bit of white to our shadow color, because up in here there's a little bit of shadow, but it's lighter. That little peak there is not correct. That should have been green. I'm just looking at my reference. I'm seeing where these little shadows are. And I think that's good. All right, I'm going to clean my brush again. Something that might help you mentally as you do these is don't get bogged down thinking, oh, that's a petal and I need to keep this petal separate. Just think of these as shapes, like a jigsaw puzzle. What is the shape and what's the color within the shape? And just forget that those are petals. If you get the right shape, the right value, and the right color in the right place, it will work out. When you get away from your painting, it's just going to be like, voila, that really reads correctly. All right, so now we're moving a little bit paler. So I'm going into this palest pink, and I'm dropping it in here. So I am almost not seeing that at all. I feel like it needs a little more color than that, so I'm going back into this. I think, oops, darn. Got a little green mixed in. Really important to keep your colors real pure at this stage. So I'm just going to drop this in. And again, we're going to have a petal coming across this, so I'm not too worried about getting that blended. But now we're going to this lightest pink on the edge of this petal, and that's where I do want to keep that transition. So I'm just switching to this lightest pink, and I'm just doing these back petals. Again, try to cover your edges. Again, if you're having trouble getting coverage over your line, you can always go back over it with pure white. All right, these petals on the far left are reading much lighter, so that's where I'm just going to take some pure white and I'm going to mix it into this palest pink, so that there's just the slightest bit of color. That's a very sharp petal. In fact, this brush is so soft, I might switch over to my little sharper edged brushes to get some of these outside edges. So let's just do this one. It does pretty well on the round ones, but on the sharper ones, this one's a little more shadowed, so I went back into this shadow where I added some white. You know, these little nuances with shadows, that might seem kind of picky and time consuming, but it's the thing that's going to make your rose read correctly, and it's going to give it form. And so down here at the bottom, that is also in shadow, but not as dark as this. So I'm just lightening that. I'm just going to pull that down. This is where I'm going to soften that edge. I've wiped my brush. So you want a really soft transition there with that shadow. This shadow went all the way to the edge of that petal, but the lighter shadow was up in here. So I'm just going to fill that in. I'm going to have to mix a little bit more shadow, so I'm taking some pink, that medium pink, a touch of that olive green, touch of white. If it's too green, add a little more pink. If it's too dark, add a little more white. Just kind of play with that until you get something that's reading correctly. That's a little too dark. I'm going to add a little more white, and I just put some white on my brush, so I'm really just kind of mixing that on the canvas. Now at that point though, it doesn't have the stay dry medium in it, so I'm going to clean my brush, wipe it off, and then I'm just going to soften this line a little bit, blur it. Okay, then we have our green leaf. All right, this one drops back, so we've got a fairly pink shadow, but then it gets pretty light here, right on that edge, and right on this little corner. Now, while that shadow is soft, there is a pretty distinct edge here between the light and the dark. So I'm just going to go along that line. I'm not going to try to brush it, the light into the dark or the dark into the light. I'm just sort of softly, my brush is damp, I've wiped it off, and I'm just sort of softly touching that edge just so you get a nice transition. Same thing over here. We want to just wiping my brush. I'm going to dampen my brush again and just touch this edge. And even though this has a slow dry medium, it may be drying. Well, it will be drying as you're working on it. So you may need to just kind of re-wet it, soften it. I am barely putting any pressure on this brush. You can also, as you go around, like this looks kind of messy, you can go back in with your dark green and we can carve in and fix these edges, so don't worry too much about that. All right, to do these next, so we have our biggest petals in. What we're going to do next are these smaller petals that are going around in a circle. So as you put them in, keep in mind that there should be a circular feel. After we get those in, then I'm just going to go in and drop some little lines to suggest these other petals. We're not going to get bogged down in that. But as we do this, I want to make sure we get enough paint on our brush. I want to try to do that petal in one stroke, do that one in one stroke. If we need to go back, like this has a little shadow, I'll need to go back and tweak it. That's got a little white highlight, but basically I'm trying to not just dab this and get some good expressive strokes. I've dropped down to one size with the Rosemary Classic Long Flat. I'm down to a size 4, and I've got my heavy body titanium white mixed with the tiniest bit of this rose pink, and that's my pile here. I'm going to mix a little more. I don't have any slow dry medium, just a tiny touch on there. I don't have any slow dry medium in this because I want it to go ahead and dry. I want to be able to work with it. So decide where that petal is going to start and where it's going to end. I'm going to put a fair amount of pressure on this brush. And I'm going to leave it. I'm going to resist that temptation to go back and dab that. I can go back and add my shadow in. You'll notice the paint's a little thick right there. I think I'm just going to leave that. All right, so now we're going to do this next petal. I'm going to get lots of paint on my brush. I'm really loading the end of my brush with a lot of paint. Keep in mind this has got to go in a circle, or it's got to have that flare. Decide where you're going to start. Notice it's starting at a point, and then it's getting bigger, and then it's getting much wider as it comes down. It actually comes kind of straight down from here, so I'm gonna add that one more stroke. It's actually leaving a lot of texture here. You can keep that or take it off. Some people like a lot of texture, some people don't. All right. Actually, that little place would have been covered. We can go back in and cover that. Okay, so this petal goes straight back, and it's going to be pinker as it goes back. It's going to be a lot pinker as it goes back. Okay. It's got a real sharp edge here. All right, the next petal is the one that might be the trickiest. I tell you, before doing this one, let's get this one in, and then we'll connect them. So I'm going back again, mainly pure white, a lot of paint on my brush, a lot of paint on the tip of the brush. Try not to get that paint down in the ferrule. And I'm going to look at where that, so that's going to come across this shadow. So you're really going to see the outline of this. So the stroke, this is one of those places. I think this painting's fairly simple, but this is an important stroke. I feel like we need a little drum roll on this one because it is important. So I'm going to sit here for a second and I'm going to think about, where is that going to start? Where is it going to go? Where is it going to come across? Then I'm going to put it down, go across, come down. That petal, I might pull some of that paint down. I did get a pretty big glob right there. This petal has a very distinctive edge. I might even take our little round brush, try this real thick paint. Let's see if that'll help me. Get that little V in there. Again, I'm just looking at the outside edge of that petal. What is it doing? And when the petal, you see there's just a thin little white line that's going to curve around and go back. So that's what we're going to do. We're not going to overthink that. Try, again, not to think of it as a petal. Just look at what the shape is. Where does it start? Where does it end? I might start here because so we see that it goes straight back. It has a little bit of a curve. It's going to need to be darker than that, but then it comes down and it's going to come underneath that. Okay, it's very white on the edge, but as it goes back, it picks up this pale pink. And then it gets back into the darkest pink right back in here. Okay, everybody good? There's also a little petal underneath this white. There's a little bit of a round ball underneath that, and I'm going to go ahead and put that in. And it's not this dark, but it's darker than this. So I'm going to take a little paint out of both those piles. You know, when you just have basically 3 or 4 values, sometimes you just need to mix those two together to take care of those little transition places. So I'm just going to do a little ball right there. Okay. All right, now when we go back up in here, we see a little bit of a pink edge. I don't really like what this brush is doing with that thick paint. Let me go back to our small rosemary. I'm going to see if I can take a little of that off. And what's happened, I feel like those two petals have sort of merged. I'm going to pull this one out just a little bit farther. Just so you get a distinction between these two petals. And I'm going to... This one has a slight curve down. Again, that may look like not a big deal, but it's those little places that can make a difference. I'm going to go back in and let's see, do we need to do anything else? Okay, so, you know, I said originally we're not going to worry about the value shift between here and trying to blend it because there's another petal there. So I'm going to go back in and put that petal in. It's a little creamier. By creamy, it's a little pinker. I'm going to take our pink and I'm going to mix a little more pink into our white. And again, I'm just going to think, where does that go? Remember, it's got to go in a circle. And then it curves around, and then it just kind of disappears. Okay. We get a slight bit of shadow on the edge of this as it turns. So I'm going to add a little shadow to the bottom edge of that and up in here. There's also a little shadow my shadow color dried out and didn't have much left, so I'm making a very light version of it. I've just added some white. I'm going to add just the slightest amount of shadow right here. All right, now we're going to tackle those little petals in between. And I like to think of this as a nautilus shell, if you've ever looked inside, and there's a center, and there are things that are just twirling out, that are just coming out from the center of it. All we need here is the illusion. We're not really worried about petals and trying to make this too hyper-realistic. I've just got a little round brush. This is a Blick Synthetic No. 4 round brush. And I'm just going to take my creamy pink. I might even, So I'm taking between the light and the medium. I'm just sort of mixing those two together and coming up with another value. I feel like my stomach keeps growling. I hope you all aren't hearing it. Sounds pretty loud to me. Okay, so we've got a center here. Let's put that center in first, which is more white with the tiniest touch of pink. I'm going to put that center in right here and pull it down. Not going to overthink it. Now I'm going to take our little pinker color. And I'm just going to pull from the center. I'm going to look at where they go. And I'm just going to put in a stroke. I'm not overthinking it. I'm not just looking at where that starts. It starts down, goes up, and then it goes back. One stroke. We've already got that one. Here's one that just goes straight across. Here's another one that goes down, and it has the slightest little ruffle edge to it. I think that's kind of pretty. And then we've got that. I'm going to put a couple of little nuances, little places where I see some shadows. I'm going to just drop in a tiny little shadow. That's just going to show that you've got a little fold right there. Dropping a little shadow down in the bottom of this. I'm going to get back from this. But one thing I'm seeing is this line does go straight back. So we want to make sure that that's reading correctly. Kind of smooth that out. Might have to. All right, let me get back for a second and let's see what we've got. I decided I didn't like that dark pink center in that rose, even though that's how it looked in the photograph. To me, it just looked like a big bullseye. It was dominating the painting. I felt like that was all that you saw. So in order to soften that and kind of alleviate that, I decided to add a little bit of Naples yellow to those pinks and just go back in and soften that up from a peachy color down to a softer dark pink. And I really like the effect of that. To me, it's a lot more elegant looking. It looked kind of harsh and posterish before. I went back in and just kind of reestablished any place I was seeing a darker color and the highlights, and just kind of putting a fresh coat on those highlights and reestablishing those whitest whites. And I'm just so pleased that I think this was time well spent. I was afraid it might get a little boring for you watching these tweaks, which can just take a while, but just working with it, continuing to touch and have nuance changes and subtle differences just until you feel like that is reading correctly. And I think it was time really well spent. Something else that was really bothering me about this painting, and I found it very distracting, was that back square looking petal. It just looked odd, and even though that's how it looked in the photograph, to me it was just really pulling my eye. I tried reshaping it and still didn't like it, so I decided to just go in with my green and just carve out a completely different shape. And I think that's a real lesson in, even though you've done something exactly like the photograph, if it's not working as a painting, if there's something that's jumping out to you, it's time to rework it. And I think this made a big difference, just giving that a smaller shape. One easy trick with leaves to get them to look realistic is to have that center line, and depending on where that line is going, you can make it look like the leaf is curved or like it's going away from you. There are a lot of different things you can do with that line, so pay attention to that line. Let's go back in and let's as we look at this leaf, we see that it's much darker on the bottom. So I'm just going to darken this lower half. I've just mixed my sap green and my olive green. I'm mindful of where that dividing line is, that middle vein, because that side's going to be more in shadow. I'm going to take the tiniest bit. Let's just see how this looks. If we don't like it, we can do something else. I'm going to put a tiny bit of Naples yellow with our olive green, because when you put white in it, it's going to get a little chalky, and we don't want it to look chalky, but we do want it to look like there's a bit of a highlight. I think that's pretty. So that's where the light is catching. The light's actually catching down at the bottom as well. Just look at your photograph. Let's put that vein in. So that vein is lighter than this light part. So I'm just going to add a little more Naples yellow. I tell you, instead of using, well, let's see how this round brush does. So look at where it's going, look at where it needs to end. This has a slight curve to it. This is where a liner brush would be mighty convenient. I feel like I can get a longer, straighter line using a liner. It'll hold more paint. Let's go ahead and put this line in. So this one just comes straight down, and then it kind of drops off. I'm going to work on this a little bit. I don't like to see just a solid color anywhere. I think the painting is more interesting. Oops, picked up a little pink. I think that's okay. I think that might have been a Bob Ross happy accident. But you don't want anything looking flat on your painting. And anytime you have opportunity, I'm going to drop in just a little bit of the Naples yellow right on top without even mixing it into a green. I'm just going to mix it in with my brush. I think that's nice. Gets pretty dark down here at the bottom. I picked up a little white on there. This is that kind of place where I think it's kind of fun just to play with your paints. See what they'll do. Try some mixing right on the canvas. Don't feel like you have to mix every color on your palette. So this leaf, I want this one to be a little more pronounced. This one's a little more in the background. It does have a little highlight right here, so let's just kind of drop that right in there. It's actually kind of highlighted up through here. And then it gets super dark down at the bottom. And just kind of drops out of the picture altogether. Okay. I'm going to get a liner brush. I'm going to have to look for it. So a liner is just a super long, narrow brush. It holds a lot of paint, and the way I like to use it is put a fair amount of water on it where you can almost see water dripping off. And then, so we're using our Naples yellow and our olive green for our veining. I'm going to put a little bit more water on there, and you can see that's very wet. And you'll put just a little bit of pressure. And it just does a great job at this sort of thing. I wouldn't even mind that just kind of disappearing down there. The veining on this side is a little darker, so I'm just adding a little more green, and I'm just going to do it just a few quick strokes so you get the feel for the direction that leaf is hanging. And I'm not even going to worry about doing anything else. So at one point I had a leaf over here. Well, let's just see if we like that. I think that's okay. Let's go back to our Naples yellow. Taking some of that olive green. Just keep in mind with your leaves, the whole painting needs to work well together. So you don't want to end up with something that's just jumping out, like that's just too bright. So I'm going to go back in, just again kind of adding some layering. It needs to be a little darker around the bottom edge. Be mindful of the veining. We could go ahead and put the veining in if you wanted to. And see, by curving it back around a little bit, that gives a nice dimension, I think, to the leaf. Just be mindful of how those veins are going. The direction of the vein really plays a visual impact of the direction of that leaf. I don't know that even, I'm just going to let that kind of fade off into the background. So that's pretty much it with the leaves. I guess we could do a slight little branch there. Let me get, actually, instead of burnt umber, I'm going to use burnt sienna, one of my favorite colors. This is a great reddish brown. I use it for animals, for tree trunks. It's just a beautiful, I use it for dirt. It's just a nice kind of reddish clay brown. It's just got more life to it than a plain brown that you're trying to lighten up. So I'm just going to go into some of that, and let's just do a little branch here. I don't think I like the brown for it going into the leaf. I'm just wiping that back off. We can thin that out using some of our green. In fact, I think I'm just adding some of that sap green to the bottom, kind of going over top of that so it's not sticking out so much. But you get the sense that there's some color there. Okay, so I'm going to go back in and just finish this background. Just kind of do another coat. I'm going to introduce a little bit of that Naples yellow here and there. I'm just mixing this on the canvas, just getting kind of a lighter corner up in here, just to have some variety. I'm going to go back in and drop some other green tones where it was just so solid. Where we've got a leaf, I'm going to go back in and just give that a nice dark corner. There's that original leaf. I'm finding it now that I'm painting over it. Really pretty, really pretty. I am just loosely kind of turning the brush, some loose strokes here and there. Maybe drop in a little spot here and there where this just looks too solid. Just trying to keep it real organic and natural looking. I think this is detracting a little bit from the rose, so I'm just going back in, dropping some darker we want the rose and the leaves to kind of come forward, so by making this a little darker, it's pushing it back into the background. That olive green right there just looks a little too perky. Okay, my friends, I think we are about there. I'm going to just hit this one more time. All right. I think I need to go back in and fix that where I've changed the shape. And I think that's good. I might highlight this leaf just a little bit more, but I don't want it to do too much. I think I might put a little branch. It's nice when you can repeat something a little bit. I might put a little branch coming through here, just so you just get a sense that there's something else going on. I'm going to go back over that with the green just so it doesn't. Might do another little branch right here. Maybe even down in here. Don't want to do too much, but just put some interest in texture. Well, there we go. Okay. And there you have a rose. So I wanted to leave you with a little food for thought. This is my friend Honey. As you've gone through this course, one is I used to paint everything by tracing it or using a projector. But I really like looser paintings, and I have found the looser the drawing that I start with, the looser the final painting is going to be. So even if you downloaded the photograph, which is great, and use that to guide you, try also doing one of these just by doing it freehand. Just look at the photograph, go back, put in some simple shapes, and see what you can do with that. You might be amazed. It took me a long time to break out of that habit. But now that I have, I'm really enjoying the freedom that it gives me, and I am finding that my paintings look a little looser. If you're doing this painting in acrylic, I do encourage you to use that slow dry medium. Even if that's something you need to purchase, it's a great tool to have in your painter's toolbox. If you've enjoyed this video, I hope you'll give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more free content. And I also encourage you to go to my new website, victoriahagemanart.com. I'll have a link in the description box below. I've got full-length courses, short tutorials, all are very reasonably priced, and you can also see my original paintings that are for sale. 25% of my painting sales go to Hydrating Humanity to build water wells. You can beautify your home while beautifying a life. Thanks for joining me.